I was down below in my quarters, and the first call went out that all personnel, both ship, we called ourselves ship and hospital crew. So it was all ship and hospital crew off duty were to report to a gathering area that was on the ship called the Gidunk area
Right.
for just to report, no information. I think what was going on was that all of those who were on duty were already getting report of what was happening out there um, with regard to the Forestall. So just report to the Gidunk area, anybody off duty, and there we met. We were met by the captain and the executive officer too.
So now by this time, this is July 67. By this time, you had been a corpsman, a Navy corpsman for about a year and a half, roughly.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And you had seen, I mean, you had been with Marines on shore, and then you're also stationed on the Repose. When the announcement goes out that something's happened, and I don't know, did they say on the PA that it's the Forestall, or did they just, as the initial word, just we need to gather?
Yeah, it was just to gather. Now that was unusual. So on the way up to the area, we did murmur to each other and say, "Wait, what's going on?" Because it was unusual for that kind of call out.
Because if it's a more routine thing where you've got if it's a more routine thing where you have helicopters coming in with wounded Marines, then the messaging is going to be different.
Correct. It would be flight quarters, flight quarters. You know, all those that are assigned to flight quarters report to duty. All hands on deck for replenishment supplies to
Sure.
get food onto the ship
Right.
from whatever was going on. So there was always a little bit of information. So this was unusual.
And when you saw the captain and the executive officer there, I mean, did that sort of confirm that something pretty serious was underway?
Yes, it wasn't dread in any way. I couldn't. I wasn't that astute that I could understand the gravity of a captain, ship's captain standing before me. It didn't hit me that way.
When you did gather and the captain and the executive officer are there, is that when they said that something had happened on the Forestall?
Yeah, yeah. It was serious, somber. Uh, there was a brief explanation of what happened. Um, an accident, basically, on the ship that was causing a conflagration, um, rockets going off,
Yeah.
fuel on the deck, explosions and such. So they gave us a pretty detailed but short description of what was happening. And the Forrestal was off the coast of North Vietnam in an area called the Gulf of Tonkin. We were up south at the DMZ at Dong Ha, just off of Dong Ha, not far but far. And they said that we were at that point we had been underway already for about an hour, uh, heading towards them to meet them, and that they alerted to that we were going to meet the ship, and would probably rendezvous with them somewhere in the Gulf of Tonkin. Uh, Once that discussion was over, we were all told to report to our regular duty stations because there were going to be additional assignments, and they would pass those through um, the duty roster that was in effect at that point.
Do you remember when you first set eyes on the Forestall? When you first got a personal sense of what had happened on the ship?
Yeah, it was it was actually when we took off and started going. I mean, when I got my assignment, I reported to my duty station, And then the head nurse, or not the head nurse, the nurse on duty said, Dave, we've gotten a report, or Laura, we've gotten a direction that you're going to go and do extra duty with regard to the incident at the Forestall. So go back down to the Gedunk area. And then there I joined a smaller group of off duty crew, both hospital and ship crew, and we got our assignments. I was part of a 10 group, what we called an away group, that would go over and help with the wounded. Uh, at that point, that's what I thought we were going to do. So I hadn't been up on deck, and I don't remember being able to see it from the deck. I'm not sure. We were pretty close. We were pretty close. So the moment we lifted, once I got onto the chopper with the other group that was going over, as we lifted off, we could see it, and it was still dark. It was just cracking dawn, so it was still kind of dark, but there was enough light to backlight it, and that's when I got a sense that the ship was roaring, that it was growling, and it felt like an animal because of the black smoke that was coming off the fantail. There were no visible flames at this point. I think the fire suppression had already taken pretty good hold. Well, I know it had when I finally got there. Uh, but the black billowing smoke out of the back had what I had a feeling, a sense of weight. I could I could sense that it had weight and life. It was frightening. It was really frightening. And as we got closer, I was able to smell the chemicals in the fire, in the smoke.
Wow. So your helo lands on the
Yeah, so we land and we were met by the head corpsman for the Forestall. I think they had about 40 medical staff on board of that carrier. I'm not sure if that's a normal complement. It sounds about right. Doctors. They probably had a doctor or two, and then corpsman. Um, we were met by him, and he alerted us that most of the wounded had already been dispersed to other carriers and ships in the area. And those ships were going to go on their way to Yokosuka, Japan, where there was a large naval hospital there. We were going to take on a small number of really badly burned crew that would not have made that trip very well. So instead, they were going to be sent over to our ship to get stabilized and and treated there as much as we could. So the real thing that we went over there for, as it turns out, was graves. We were going to get the dead and take them over back to our ship and store them. And in fact, during that gathering before I left, there was a direction for a group of people to go down below into the hold and clean out two very large, cool storerooms where food and meat and stuff were stored. So at that point, I did the old math and went, we're going to take the dead and put them in our food lockers, and
pose.
that was ended up being the job that I had.
What are the sights that I'm sure were burned into your mind's eye as you get off that helo? You're getting a feel for the situation. Probably within a few minutes, you're heading down to get those bodies. What are some of the sights you remember, the sights and sounds you remember?
It was chaos, um, controlled chaos. People say that all the time. the head corpsman though had his act together, and as we started to get our assignment, I saw that there was many body bags on the deck of the Forestall. Okay, so those are going to go, and then the rest of us are split up because they had found bodies in areas that they still needed help because his gang, the corpsmen on there, were
Yeah.
exhausted. They had been at this since, well, for about 18 hours already by the time we got there.
Wow. Yeah.
So they needed help in retrieving the rest of the dead. I didn't realize it, but behind me, or I did realize it, but behind me, already the burned, those that we were going to be treating on the repos were going on choppers heading over there. So I was assigned to a crew quarters just below the flight deck, and I was pretty bombed out because the explosions went through the deck. In fact, it went all the way down to the hangars below. And in the tangle, they had found some dead crew members that were still in their bunks,
Mhm.
and that we were tasked to bag them and bring them out. I think I had to get 3 or 4.
Pull them out of their bunks.
Mhm.
So, I mean, by this time you had seen, you had been on shore with the Marines and you had seen the result of combat.
Yeah.
You had been on the repose and you'd had a lot of, seriously wounded Marines come to there. How would you compare this experience on the Forestall to what you had already experienced by this point?
Uh, in my life from that time, I never thought of myself as being um, a combat anything. I was only on the beach, as we would call it, really at the most 4 weeks, and even that was spread out through 3 days here, 2 days there. I never went on a jungle recon, and I only went on one dust off. So my whole belief of being in any kind of combat, I never claimed that as a civilian after I got out. I always thought of myself as only being on the repos, a cushy job, certainly danger wise was cushy. But in treating my PTSD, I realized that the Forestall was more combat horror than a lot of veterans experience. I was involved at that moment in the death of, I think it was 123 dead at once, at one time.
Mhm.
And there aren't many veterans of the Vietnam War that can say that.
How old were you at this time?
19,
So 19 years old. And what
18. I was 18.
you were 18 because you went into the Navy when you were 17.
Correct. Yeah. So I was 18.
18 years old. And the reason I ask that is, first of all, I mean, you think about the responsibilities that are given to 18, 19, 20-year olds in the world of war, and that's something. And certainly you've been handed a massive responsibility. But also, one of the things that you were asked to do I believe once these bodies are taken back to their repose, after you read hundreds of war memoirs and speak to hundreds of war vets, um, there are things you hear, and you notice them and they strike you. But after a while, you don't really pause over it. But there is something that you describe in your memoir, something you were asked to do, um, that really did cause me to pause. And I asked, just one of those things, how in the world could a teenager have done this? I mean, just, how would a teenager have the wherewithal to do what he was asked to do? Now, I guess you had medical training and you had seen a lot of rough things before. Um, and what I'm talking about is, they're trying to get information, physical information from these bodies that are burned beyond recognition about, who is this sailor, so we can identify this sailor. Are you willing to share what you were asked to do?
Yeah, it's odd. I don't know why I'm doing this, but because I don't hear others talking about the kind of horribleness that I did. So I'm saying this for the history of it. Um, when we got back to the ship with the first group of dead that we had loaded together, and trust me, by this time, it was already a horrific situation that I was in, getting those bodies out of those racks.
Mm.
There was one that I pulled back a rack that was on top of him, and his arm was across his head like this. And I realized he was asleep and he had just literally died that way. So I had already touched a burned sailor in doing all of that. You have to touch them. You have to touch them.
To get them out.
Yeah. And put them in the body bag. Excuse me, this is kind of hard. Um, I thought I would have to go back a couple of times to get the dead, but when the gang and I got back with our first load of body bags, we were told to go immediately down to the lockers and start working there. And so down there, we began to organize the burn and the in the body bags in a way that we would be able to start to get to them. There were I don't remember, tables put in there and planks of wood and envelopes being prepared, and then it started. The chief surgeon and the chief told us that we would have to start gathering what we call today forensics identifiers. We would go through in teams of two and go through each, go and work on the dead, looking for any identifiers. So first, if they weren't completely burned, if they had died through trauma of blunt force or something, then they had their uniforms on. So we would cut off the name labels because we all had our names that we stencil ourselves in all of our clothing. And so we would cut all of those and put them in an envelope that was uh, numbered to that corpse. We would also note any tattoos, anything that we could identify, even bits of paper. I found a Liberty card in one of the guys' uh, dungarees. And so, along with all of the other clippings and tattoo and all of the description, if we could see color of hair, blah, 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 we would all put that in these envelopes with our notes and such. But the thing that was really going to get these guys home was their teeth. I mean, we didn't have DNA in those days, and identifying a body at that point had already developed to the high technological ability of having dental charts. Every sailor has a dental chart. So we were to plot the teeth of every body that we worked on. So I had to touch them again. The worst, actually, oh no, I can't say the worst. It was all bad. Those that were completely burned were literally just skeletons burned. The flesh had already gone. Maybe there was something that was attached, but they were burned completely. And so getting to their teeth was difficult. We had to use chest spreaders and large surgical instruments to break the jaw. We had to, in some cases, cut their faces from the ear down to the jaw so that we could get it open wide enough to be able to look in and plot the teeth.
Was there almost a feeling, when you're dealing with wounded Marines, then what you're doing, you're working on patching them up. In this case, you're almost disassembling these corpses. I mean, did it almost feel like this work that you're doing, although the mission is we got to identify this guy so the family can be notified and we can have, we can bury the remains and know who it is. But did it almost feel like this was a desecration of the bodies as you're doing what it takes to get at these teeth?
The first time it, we were going to mutilate these bodies, literally. And when we were given our direction of what we were going to do, you know what? It was the unburned ones that was harder because they looked more human to me. We were going to mutilate them, but the chief who was giving us the instructions, he had a cigar in his mouth. The smell of death. I, I've never forgotten that. And I realized he had that cigar in his mouth because it was covering the smell. Smart man. He stopped at the end of it because I guess the looks on our faces conveyed the horror at the thought of what our next assignment was going to be. And he stopped and he whispered, I know what we're asking you to do, but it's the only way to get them home.
Wow.
So he clipped it right there. That feeling of desecration, of
Mhm.
mutilation, of horror that we were going to be doing to these poor sailors and Marines, but mostly sailors. He clipped it right there, and uh, and that allowed me, at least, to move forward and do the assignment. Do the assignment. Do it, and I just did it. I did it over and over again. I don't even know how many, although a friend of mine later said I did like 19 or 18. He had stopped doing it after the third one. He couldn't do it anymore. But I pushed myself. Just do it. You got to get them home. You got to get them home.
Wow.
That's what I did.
How long did that go on, roughly? I know you're not watching
Until
the
the
clock.
next day. Until the next day, probably we ran it for 18 hours. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I didn't do anything during that time except that work. I take breaks. That was also near the surgical area, the OR area, operating room, and my one of my best friends was uh, a OR tech, so he was also in there working with us. He came over and did some of this too. And I would go over to his area and we'd take a break together and just sit and smoke. So 18 hours, maybe.
And
They wouldn't let anybody when we were bringing the dead in. They wouldn't let anybody into the corridors. As I think about it now, they just wanted to keep the horror clamped to the smallest number of military personnel as possible. So even after all of this and doing, a night of what we did, the next day we had arrived at Da Nang, and they asked us to then bring the corpses and the body bags back up on deck for them to be taken away. So we did both ends. At first, I was a little bit angry, but I grew to understand that they was going to limit the number of military personnel that were going to be hurt by this because they knew we were going to be hurt or traumatized.
you were angry because you felt like all of this had been dumped on you and all these other guys are not having to deal with this the way I have to deal with it.
Yeah, in a way, I was angry at that point. Sure.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So, was this experience then for you? The chief, the chief acknowledges this is hard duty, guys. And then you say, I just did it. And was it just one of those things that you often hear from vets where, in a way, you just kind of have to put your humanity and your natural impulses aside and just let the training be what it is, and all that humanity stuff that you put away at that moment, you're going to deal with that later. But for these 18 hours, you're just kind of on task.
Yeah, I didn't, of course, use the philosophical ideal of humanity. It was just, I was a simple, I was a very simple child. I never finished high school, so I didn't have a lot of high level of thinking at that point. I don't know who that boy is.
Mhm.
So it was just more of the training, just the
Well,
militariness, the world that I was in that said you just do this,
let's do
whether
it.
you like it or not.
Um, well, so how did this incident change that boy? And there are other things that you experienced in the Vietnam conflict, but here we're focusing on the Forrestal. That kid who didn't finish high school, but is now doing a procedure that, is unimaginable, I think, to the overwhelming majority of people. And you put it away for those hours, but obviously it sticks with you. I mean, if we just you've got your whole Vietnam service, but if we isolate this incident with the Forrestal, if it's possible to isolate it in your mind, how would you say that event still lives with you? How did it change that 18-year-old kid?
This one incident put in my mind, and I even remember at that point putting it in my mind that I could do anything if I just tried. I didn't know that I had a future when I went into the Navy. Um, Certainly being a dropout, I pretty much figured out I would be working at a gas station for the rest of my life. So I didn't have any dreams. So this incident put in my mind that I could do maybe other things. And it sounds like I really analyzed it that much, and I kind of did, but didn't. So understand that it's difficult for me to go from now to past then, that little boy. But I do remember getting a feeling that I had strength. That's the best way to put the way I remember feeling that because KC, a man that I was in boot camp with, a man who I went to core school and then the repose with, a man who had beaten me up that New Year's past when he caught me kissing another man. He gay bashed me. I was up on deck watching as the bodies were being put into refrigerator trucks, and he came up behind me and he said, I don't know what you call yourself, a fag, a homo, queer. I don't know what to call you, but I know that you're more of a man than anyone I know, that I fell out after three and you did so many more. So you are more of a man. And then he walked away.